Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, The Importance of Computer System Validation for Regulated Systems. I'm Laura Bush, the Editorial Director of LCGC, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We're pleased to bring you this web seminar presented by LCGC and sponsored by Agilent Technologies. Agilent is a leader in life sciences, diagnostics, and applied chemical markets. The company provides laboratories worldwide with instruments, services, consumables, applications, and expertise, enabling customers to gain the insights they seek. Agilent's expertise and trusted collaboration give customers the highest confidence in Agilent solutions. Before we get started today, we have a few housekeeping announcements. First, the webcast is designed to be interactive, so we encourage you to ask questions. You can submit questions at any time by typing them in the Q&A box, which you can find on the right-hand side of your screen. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small square icon in the upper right-hand corner of the slide window, or by hovering your mouse over the lower right-hand corner and dragging the window to the desired size. The slides will advance automatically during the webcast. And if you have any technical problems viewing or hearing the presentation today, please click on the question mark Help widget in the dock at the bottom of your window. I would now like to introduce today's speakers. We are very pleased to be joined today by Jim Willis and Michael Corbell. Jim Willis has more than 20 years of experience in instrument qualification based on USP Chapter 1058 and AIQ, and computer system validation based on 21 CFR Part 11 and GAMP 5 in FDA-regulated GMP and GLP environments. He holds degrees in both chemistry and biology from the University of Delaware. Currently, Jim is the Global Compliance Program Manager at Agilent Technologies. His primary responsibilities are overseeing the instrument and software qualification business, utilizing Agilent's automated compliance engine, the Compliance Outbound Marketing Program, and compliance consulting services, including computer system validation. Prior to joining Agilent, Jim held positions as the Global Director of Validation and Compliance Services at PerkinElmer, and as the Senior Compliance Services Manager at Thermo Fisher Scientific. He also worked for Laboratory Management Systems Incorporated as a service manager and regulatory consultant for pharmaceutical companies who were under consent decrees with the FDA. Michael Corbell has more than 20 years of experience in regulated environments in the pharma and biotech industries. He has spent half of his career on the client side, working in the lab and IT, supporting, qualifying, and validating regulated systems and regulated instruments, and computerized systems. And the other half of his career on the vendor side, supporting and validating lab informatics systems and performing instrument qualification, preventive maintenance, and relocation services. He has held various IT and lab positions at companies including Mankind Corporation, Purdue Pharma, PerkinElmer, and Waters Corporation. He holds a BS in biology with minors in chemistry and environmental science. Thank you both for joining us today. Jim, please go ahead and get us started.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to the webinar. Today we will be talking in depth about computer system validation as well as some industry trends, and spending quite a bit of time focusing on the GAMP model for computer system validation. From a high level, the agenda that we're going to cover today, the first section is really going to be around what is computer system validation, why is it important, and why do we do it, some basic definitions of what validation is, some of the regulations around, again, GAMP 5, Part 11, and data integrity, as well as going through some industry trends, data. The second section is really going to be a deep dive into the GAMP 5 life cycle approach. What are the GAMP 5V model documents and what is contained within those and why those are important to your validation. And then finally, the last section will be around some of the Agilent service offerings that we have in this space to help our customers to achieve their compliance goals. And then finally, there will be the Q&A section of the webinar. So like I said, the first section is really around what is CSV and why is it important to do. So diving right in, we'll start off first just with the validation, the definition of what validation is. There are a number of different definitions out there. This is kind of the one that we selected that has pretty good information that I'd like to spike out. So I'll kind of read this off to you. So this validation is really the establishment of documented evidence that provides a high degree of assurance that a system or process will consistently meet predetermined specifications. So a few key parts that I want to spike out. One is that, again, it needs to be documented evidence. We need to make sure that we record the information correctly. Consistently meet specifications. So again, there will be pass-fail criteria as part of our specifications, and we need to make sure that the system passed our tests. And then finally, user requirements are going to be critical to ensure that we test the system based on the intended use. So high level, that's kind of the definition of what validation is. And as we go through this webinar, you'll hear a lot more about the pieces that make up the validation effort. And the other thing to also keep in mind is that validation is a life cycle approach. So again, whenever you purchase a new system and putting it into a regulated environment, you have to do, as part of its commissioning, full system validation on that. So this is probably, the biggest investment of time as far as validation goes. And then from there, the system will fall under change control, and the system will require validation if there's any other changes to the system. And as those changes come out, whether that be an upgrade or a relocation or, some other change to the system, that change has to be evaluated to see the level of change and then, the amount of risk and how much revalidation would be required on that system. And then finally, systems come to the end of their life cycle and for retirement or decommissioning. And then, at this point, we have to make sure that we gather up all of the records for that system and that those are available, in the future for any type of audit or investigation. So why is it that we validate systems? And, there's a few very strong reasons, but probably the reason that most people have to validate their system is because it's a requirement based on the regulations for the laboratory in which they work. A number of regulated industries such as pharma, medical device, food and dietary supplements, and tobacco and others require, again, that systems are required to be validated. So a lot of times that's why we do that, because, again, we want to meet the regulations and not have any negative effects due to audits, things like that. The other key piece to this, today, the main focus for many of the regulatory audits is around data integrity. So computer system validation is one of the foundations for creating a strong data integrity compliance program. So again, a lot of it around data security, making sure that your test results cannot be manipulated or falsified, and also ensuring that, unauthorized personnel don't have access to the system. So again, by validating the system and creating the users and permissions and locking the system down, you can help to improve your data integrity. So again, that's key. And then finally, validating your system ensures, reliable data. So again, it makes good scientific sense. The industries that we're in, it's all data driven. So we want to make sure that we have high confidence and that our data is trustworthy. And by validating systems, we can ensure that. So that's critical for us. And the other thing to keep in mind is in this regulated space, these regulations are laws. So in violating those, there are specific penalties that can be, civil or criminal. A lot of times these are significant fines. So it could be, high dollar fines. It could be legal action, disbarment. There's a number of different risks to not complying. Loss of revenue. Obviously, if data was produced on a system that wasn't validated, it could be cause for a product recall, which obviously would cost quite a bit of money to the company. And then finally, as we mentioned, again, we just want to make sure that, again, we have confidence and reliability in our data stream because, again, the data is what drives our business today. So we want to talk a little bit about regulations. Obviously, there's a lot of different regulations that come into play when we talk about computer system validation. And kind of starting at the base level, obviously the predicate rules are involved whenever we talk about any of the compliance activities. So again, our 21 CFR, our Food and Drug Administration regulations 210 and 211, which are our good manufacturing practices, as well as Part 58, which is our good laboratory practices, come into play, whether paper or digital system. Since we're talking about software validation, we're obviously referring to electronic systems. And again, building off this base of the predicate rules, from there we would work into our Part 11 compliance. Again, looking at electronic records and electronic signatures. So we spend a lot of time in our computer system validation projects testing a lot of the Part 11 requirements. So some of those are, again, the electronic records security. We shouldn't be able to delete any data files or obscure those files in any way. It's important to have the audit trails in place to capture any changes to any of the data files, who did it, when they did it, why they did it. The backup, archive, and disaster recovery piece, again, we should never lose any data. So by having that backup system in place, being able to always be able to recover the data as well as the system is very key. We talked a little bit about, the login and password and permissions, making sure, again, that only authorized personnel have access to the system and can make changes within the system. And then finally, electronic signatures to move towards, a fully paperless type of laboratory solution. So that's Part 11. As we mentioned, and we've talked a little bit, data integrity, obviously, the key point to the foundation for why we validate systems and why computer system validation is important. We did put a few examples of some of the data integrity guidances here. We listed 3 of them. So the FDA, the MHRA, and the ISPE, just as a few examples of some of those guidance documents. And the drafts, the dates of 2016, and then obviously they were released, and those dates should be 2018. And then finally, the last piece, and where we're going to spend the majority of our time in discussion today, is really around GAMP 5. And this is the guideline that we follow when we do computer system validation projects. And again, many of you have probably heard of the risk-based approach or the V model documentation. So that's really where we're going to spend a lot of our time in Section 2 talking about that. But again, this is the universal process guideline that we follow to validate software. So I am going to go into GAMP 5 from a high level and talk a little bit about the structure and some of the documentation that makes up the GAMP 5 V model. And then Michael will be in Section 2 going into each one of these documents into much more detail to give you some of the background as far as what's included in each one of these documents and why it's important. So from a high level, starting in the upper left-hand part of the V, we start with the risk assessment, which is the key part, is, again, understanding the level of risk, understanding the category that the particular system falls into, and making sure that the correct amount of validation is applied to the system is key. From there, we move to the validation plan, and again, the overarching plan for the project, what's included, the deliverables, who's involved, milestones, those types of things as far as validation project goes. Then we have 3 distinct requirements documents. First of all, the user requirement, which is very critical to make sure, again, that we are testing the system based on our intended use. Then the functional requirement, and sometimes they get bundled together, the user requirement and the functional requirement together. And then finally, the configuration specification. Again, anything within the software that is configurable, like the user groups, the permission levels, things like that have to be configured and set up. Now, moving up the right-hand side of the V, we have our installation qualification, and that will be doing testing of all of our configuration settings and specifications. Then from there, the operational qualification that, again, will be testing our functional requirements. And then finally, our performance qualification, which is really a day in the life of the instrument. We'll be testing our user requirements. There is also requirements around SOPs. We're not really going to go into that as much in this presentation, but there's SOPs required around the use, the maintenance, the training for the system as well. So those SOPs are important. And then finally, we have the traceability matrix, which is a key document to make sure that, again, anything that we had a specification for, that we did testing on, and that, kind of checks and balances, make sure everything was done. And then finally, we have the validation summary report, which, again, tells what we did as part of the validation project, and if there were any deviations or any failures that occurred, how those were dealt with during the project. So again, that's kind of the V model at a high level, just to give you an idea of what the documentation is and what the interaction between them. And then, like I said, in the next section, we're going to go into a lot more detail on each one of those and what information is captured within those. And then finally, the last part of this section, just wanted to talk a little bit about regulatory trends a little bit. So we did a little FDA warning letter research, and we looked under the laboratory controls piece, really where the data integrity focus is, where again, validated systems for intended use and access controls, and all the things that kind of fall under computer system validation fall under this laboratory controls section. So just kind of wanted to give you an idea of some of the regulatory trends here. So you can kind of look from 2010 to about 2015. We had about an average about 54 warning letters per year. Pretty flat, but still a significant number of warning letters there. And then you can see in 2016 we've started to see this upward turn. So an increased level of from auditing level from regulatory agencies focused around this data integrity, validation, laboratory control perspective. So we've seen quite a bit of an increase over the last 3 years, and we are expecting to see that trend continue. So again, this is a key focus area for many of the regulatory agencies. And now we have a polling question.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, for all of you in the audience, we would like you to participate in this polling question. You can click directly on your screen to enter your answers. So here's the question. Do you incorporate the regulatory requirements into your computerized system validation to ensure data integrity? Yes or no? So once again, you can click directly on your screen to enter your answer. And that question is, do you incorporate the regulatory requirements into your computerized system validation to ensure data integrity? Yes or no? All right, let's pull up those results. And the vast majority said yes, 88%. Now I'd like to pass it over to Michael for the next section of the presentation.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Michael Corbell, and we will be talking about Part B. I will get into some depth now on the GAMP 5V model documents that you typically see in a computerized system validation project. So one of those first documents that typically I would do is a risk assessment. And some people may call this a regulatory risk assessment or an initial risk assessment. Either way, this is going to help us maximize that risk-based approach to computerized system validation within the GAMP 5 paradigm. So a couple of things we want to do with this risk assessment. First is determine which regulations are applicable to our system and the data. We may be looking at GMP or GLP, Annex 11, China FDA, and other regulatory bodies around the world. And we can ask certain questions based on those regulations to figure out if our system or the data is used in a manner that is applicable to any of those regs in GMP, GLP, or otherwise. But we should also determine the level of risk. Simply knowing there's risk is not quite good enough. We'd like to know if it's critical, high, medium, or low. So within those levels, I have a little bit of explanation or definition of each level. So if we look at critical risk, we see that it's a direct impact on product safety, identity, quality, efficacy, purity, or may affect decisions relating to your product release. This would be definitely validation is required, and it would be a fairly comprehensive validation effort. High risk. So a high risk would be an indirect impact on product safety, identity, quality, efficacy, purity, or affect decisions related to your product release. Validation is certainly required, but the testing may not have to be quite as comprehensive as the critical risk system. Maybe a quick example so you understand the difference between the two. Critical risk system might be a chromatography data system that you're using to assay your main finished drug product for the API in the product. A high-risk system might be perhaps the water purification system because you use the water to prepare your samples that are then analyzed on the HPLC system. A medium-risk system is where there is no perceived impact on product safety, identity, quality, etc., and no perceived effect on your decision related to product release. We suggest that validation takes place at the medium risk level, but it is not mandatory. I certainly would suggest qualification of the instrumentation, the hardware, qualification or verification of the software. A low-risk system would be a failure of the system is limited to a non-essential business process. Validation is not required, but we do recommend qualification or verification takes place. The next document that I would create in the GAMP5 paradigm is the validation plan. So the validation plan minimally should provide these number of things. First, a system overview and objectives of the validation project. System overview could be fairly high level, state the, name of the system and what basically it'll be used for. And the objectives are what you want to produce at the end of this project, what you want to achieve. The scope of the system should go a little bit more into detail in the system, list the number of servers and clients, the type of software and version of the software application you're installing and validating, and maybe even the types and number of instrumentation that you'll be controlling and collecting data from. Also, the project itself should have a scope, and that is, what is in scope for what you're validating? Is the network infrastructure in scope? Is there data migration in scope from one system to another? Is there another system like a LIMS system that interfaces with your system that you're validating that you need to validate the interface to that other system where data travels to the other system? Roles and responsibilities regarding the validation should have a project team, and minimally the team should have a system owner or subject matter expert from the laboratory or the end user group, should have a member of the IT department, and it should have a member of the quality assurance department, as well as you may have consultants or a tech writer who's helping you write the documentation. So the roles and responsibilities of those members of the team should be outlined in that section. You should have a table for definitions and acronyms and common terms so that throughout the project it is well known throughout the project team what certain terms mean. You should also have a reference table for what regulations and internal policies and SOPs are applicable to your system and the project. There should be a section where you make some statements around your validation rationale and your strategy. So here's a place where you could basically document that you're following the GAMP5 rationale, that you may talk about how you're going to test the system. You may talk about the different deliverables and documents for the system and what they do overall to help the project achieve success. I also include the risk assessment results in the validation plan. It's a good place to state what your risk assessment results were and therefore what they may mean to the overall project. I would also list out any deliverables, documentation and other deliverables that may be an outcome of the project. Certainly it should be the deliverables we're talking about here in these documents Could also be types of SOPs or training materials. Project milestones, I would definitely want to put in some sort of milestones and maybe even a project timeline. Some folks are kind of savvy with MS Project or Excel to create timelines, and you could put basically a high-level timeline in here. Then I have a statement around acceptance criteria and system release. What is it going to take for the system to meet your acceptance criteria and be released in the production environment? Training requirements. Typically, these are requirements that the project team members should be trained on in order to take part in this project. And then document management. How are you going to manage these documents and deliverables as they are approved? Where do they go to be stored and stay in their approved state? And what do you do about revisions when you need to revise them? Minimally, those are the topics I would cover in a validation plan. The next couple of documents, or sometimes they're put into one document, are the user and functional requirements. Very important part of the project. These are really going to help us, give us a basis for how we're going to configure, use, and ultimately test the system to make sure that it meets your requirements and that when it's released in production environment, that it's a system producing reliable, valid data. So the user requirements capture your intended use of the system. They should reference a business capability to be executed. They should ensure that the system is designed, configured, and used in a manner that's consistent with scientific methods, SOPs, and regulations. They should be high level, but not so much at a functional level. So for example, one statement might be, the system shall provide the ability to control an HPLC pump. So this is a fairly high-level statement, but it is testable. I could test that statement. You'll see in the functional requirements that we can boil that statement down into further lower-level, more functional requirements. So moving into the functional requirements, these should describe how the system meets the user requirements. They should address the technical solution to the user requirements. Okay? So they should be a little bit more detailed and address a specific function within the software. That might be a button, it might be a menu item, it might be a parameter that needs to be populated. So for example, based on the user requirement above, we could say the system must provide the functionality to control flow rates between 0.5 and 2.0 mils per minute. That is a detailed, functional, and testable requirement of the system. There could be other functional requirements related to the same user requirement, such as a requirement around gradients or other types of parameters we can control in the HPLC pump, for example. So sometimes we have multiple functional requirements mapped back to one user requirement. The next document that I would produce in the CSV package would be either a configuration or design specification. These terms do get used interchangeably in the industry. So to be clear, a configuration specification is generally created for a COTS or commercial off-the-shelf system, like the type of software that a vendor like Agilent may manufacture. Design specifications are more used for customized software and usually not COTS software. So if you're coding something in-house or really customizing something, you may want to create a design specification that really captures the coding and the design of the tool that you're creating. But either way, both documents should describe at a minimum first a system architecture, and I typically use an illustration to show the standalone or client-server architecture of the system and how it interacts across your network. You should also have minimum or required hardware and software components so that when you build your servers or your clients, you make sure that the hardware for those machines meets the manufacturer's specifications for installing the software in that environment. And you should also know what software components. What is your Windows operating system and version? What is the application software in question and its version, as well as any other ancillary software like Internet Explorer or Adobe PDF. Your time and date settings and the format, specifically the format around time and date and how they should be displayed in the system are very critical. And the security to protect the time and date so that no one can change or alter the time and date Thus, they could also alter some data integrity. It could lead to a data integrity issue. Access and security settings, very important that we limit access only to authorized users. So we want to make sure that the system is physically secure in the location that it resides in, but also virtually secure so that the operating system and the application both provide some measure of protection so that only authorized users could log into the system. And I think that folds into the next two bullets as well. The login parameters, very important to check that the system enforces the correct login parameters in order to gain access to the system. And also the user privileges or permissions, which in some systems is called roles and groups. It's very important that the users of the system have the correct permissions that mimic their job role so that they can only do the things that they're assigned to do within the system. Audit trail settings, there's usually not too much. You really just want to make sure they're turned on and they can never be turned off or modified so that once the audit trail is turned on, it's forever collecting the audit trail data and cannot be modified or deleted. And any other configurable settings that are needed for the software to meet your user requirements. You may describe things like data backup and restore processes, a system recovery process, anything else, sometimes even instrument communication settings. Next, we have the section of the validation that probably most users are familiar with, the IQ, OQ, and PQ protocols and test scripts. This is known as the testing phase of the project. And there are some other terms. I think installation testing, I've heard, UAT, user acceptance testing. They're all pretty similar. I'll stay with IQ, OQ, PQ for this talk, though. IQ is the installation qualification. It's testing the fact that we've installed and configured the system according to our configuration specification document. The OQ tests the functional requirements, and the PQ tests the user requirements to make sure that the system allows the end users to perform their workflow through the application the way they need it to work. Each qualification, no matter if it's IQ, OQ, or PQ, will have a protocol to describe things like the objectives and scope of the protocol, roles and responsibilities of the testing team, and the validation strategy and how the test scripts will be executed. So there should be instructions for how to execute test scripts, most of which will be based on good documentation practices. There should also be a signature identification page so that anyone involved in the execution of the test scripts should be identified in the signature identification page. And you must have deviation report forms and deviation log because you may run into some problems that you have to document correctly and keep a log of those issues and how you corrected them. There could be an amendment form as well if you need to update the test script. And there could also be a closure checklist. Some people like to do a summary report at the end of each testing phase. You could also use what's called a closure checklist at the end of the IQ to close out the IQ and allow the OQ to start execution, and the same thing at the end of OQ to allow the PQ to commence testing. And then typically what I would do is wrap up with a summary report at the end of the PQ that speaks to all of the testing phase. At the bottom of this slide, there's an example of what a test script may look like. Typical test script, we have a step number. We have a specified action or procedure that tells us discrete instructions of what to do. We have a requirement number that tells us exactly what requirement is being met by this test. We have an expected result, and then we've written out the actual result, which is very important to do. And then we have shown here, we've noted that a screenshot is attached. We have a status. We've made a determination of pass, and we could have made a pass or fail determination in the status cell. And then lastly, we have an initial and date for who is accountable for performing this step. The next document is the traceability matrix. The trace matrix will show the relationship between user requirements, functional requirements, and configuration specifications. But it also maps the requirements to their testing. So the config specs are mapped to IQ, functional requirements to OQ, and user requirements to PQ. Sometimes The OQ can prove user requirements, and there's some crossover. It doesn't necessarily have to be a strict relationship as shown, but that's the general relationship between testing and the requirements and specifications. You really should complete your trace matrix and approve it along with the PQ protocol, or at the very least with the validation summary report. Better to have it at least reviewed before all your testing is completed, just to ensure that all requirements were properly covered by the testing. And here is a sample of a traceability matrix table, and we'll show you, starting on the left-hand side, there's a user requirement, U-1.01, and next to that is the descriptions where the user requirement is literally written out. You can copy and paste that out of your URS document. And next to that, we have a URS test ID where that user requirement was actually tested. Now, in this particular example, it was tested in OQ test script 7, when typically probably we'd see a lot of user requirements tested by a PQ test script. Moving to the column over, we have FRS number. That's the functional requirement specification number. And you can see there are 7 different functional requirements related to one user requirement. And those were tested by, it looks like, OQ test script number 6 and number 7. Moving further right, we have a configuration specification related to this user requirement. It's CS-4.31, and that configuration specification was tested by IQ test script number 4. There's also an other or comment column. In this case, we had a non-applicable. Lastly, we would create a validation summary report document, and this is probably the most important document when it comes to a regulatory auditor coming to your site, and if they're interested in a particular system that you validated, they may start with this document and work backwards. This document is really going to address the validation plan, because the validation plan states what the project should accomplish, and this document will state what the project did accomplish. Often during these projects, and they may last weeks or months to get done, especially during testing, you may change the way you're going to use the system. You may find out the system behaves a little bit differently than you thought it did, and you may change a little bit of the way you validated the system and how you're going to use it. And those types of changes between the validation plan at the beginning of the project and the VSR at the end of the project can be documented in the VSR document. The VSR should also list all of the documents created to validate the system and the date when each document was approved. This could also include SOPs and training materials. The VSR lists the testing results in a pass-fail status fashion for each of the IQ, OQ, and PQ test scripts, as well as any deviations encountered during testing and the corresponding corrective action to close each of those deviations. Auditors really like to see this because they like to see how you handled something that didn't go right, and that is real world. Things aren't perfect, and they like to see how you handled something that there was a non-conformance or test discrepancy and the corrective action to that. Approval of the VSR releases the system for production use. In most companies, they use the validation summary report to release it for production use. I've seen a few companies that used a memo of release, but typically the summary report is the document that releases it. Prior to production use, all system-related SOPs must be approved and effective, and the end users must be trained on those SOPs before they can use the system. This is what grants them the authorization to get into the system. And here we are. We have our second polling question.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yes, for all of you in the audience, we would like you to participate in the second polling question. Again, you can click directly on your screen to enter your answers. So here's that question. Which validation process does your company utilize for computer system validation? GAMP5, Agile, or other? Again, you can click right on your screen to answer, and that question is, which validation process does your company utilize for computer system validation? GAMP5, Agile, or other? All right, let's pull up those results. We've got kind of a split here, about 61% using GAMP5, about almost 37% using some other system. All right, now I'll hand it off to Jim for the last portion of the talk.
Thank you. So our last section, we really wanted to get into a little bit around some of the services that we currently provide to help with a number of the validation type activities that we've been talking about. So one area is our compliance consulting services. This is an area, again, where we're offering customized validation services. So again, very specific to projects and systems within your laboratory. And the first one, obviously, is computer system validation services based on GAMP5, like we're talking about here. We've done a number of projects in this space helping our customers to validate their systems to meet regulatory requirements. The other area that we've been involved with quite a bit has been around doing audits and assessments, especially as it pertains to data integrity compliance and helping customers to remediate any gaps they may have. And then finally, we've been doing some projects around custom procedure writing. And again, this could be things like the SOPs we had talked about earlier, use, maintenance, training, et cetera, but could, be other documents as well, even, like customized qualification documents. And then one other area that we've been focusing on quite a bit as well has been validation starter kits. So we've developed some generic starter kits for validation based on the GAMP5 documentation that we just talked about, and really to provide about 80% of the content required to validate a system. And then obviously there would still be another 20%, 25% that would need to be customized to, again, ensure that the validation would be specific for your intended use. And again, the reason we've done this is really to streamline the CSV process to help to save both time and cost upwards of around 50%, which is quite significant. And then those starter kits can either be purchased directly and executed, with the in-house group, or again, we can utilize those starter kits as part of a CSV consulting type project. And we also offer execution services, so we can actually come on site with engineers and we can execute IQ/OQ test scripts for you to, again, help you to get your systems up and operational faster. I also want to kind of give you a kind of a sneak peek into the next part of our webinar series. So there will be a part 2 of this webinar, and it's really around how electronic data systems meet data integrity requirements. So again, we're going to give some real-life examples of how the actual software and the internal controls help to meet regulatory requirements. So we will be walking through some of the guidelines and regulations again, looking at predicate rules and Part 11 and the data integrity guidance documents as well. And again, showing how electronic systems actually, the parts of the software and how they actually will help to ensure some of the technical controls, the data storage piece and electronic signatures, the logins, the audit trails, and all of that specific parts of the software and how they work and how they're there to work to help you to maintain a compliant system, getting back to that laboratory controls piece. And then finally, again, some real-life examples from some of our Open Lab software suite, looking specifically at Part 11 controls, how those work within the software to meet the regulations. So again, looking at the data security, user access, how the electronic signatures workflow work, and how the audit trails capture information and how that's critical to meet the regulations. So all of that is in our next part of our webinar series. And Humaira Kaja, who is our Software Compliance Program Manager, will be the presenter. She has over 10 years of experience in the computer system compliance space. So we're really looking forward to the next webinar in the series, and we hope that you can join us for that. And with that, we have another polling question.
Thank you very much, Jim. We do indeed have another polling question, and here it is for all of you in the audience. It's on your screen now. And that question is, are you interested in finding out more about Agilent compliance services or informatics solutions? Yes or no? So once again, you can click on your screen to answer. And that question is, are you interested in finding out more about Agilent compliance services or informatics solutions? Yes or no? Okay, so let's go on to our Q&A. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do that. Sorry, I lost my little reminder script there. You can do that by typing it in the Q&A box, which you can find on the right-hand side of your screen. All right, so let's get started here. We've got quite a few questions coming in. So here's one to start. With validating laboratory software, is the vendor software qualification and lifecycle validation all that is required, or should additional validation be performed? How do we find the balance?
Yeah, so we always try to, when we validate systems, leverage the instrument and software qualification packages that are offered. But again, a lot of times those are for out-of-the-box functionality and don't test, obviously, all of the configuration and intended use part. So usually, they work in conjunction, and as part of your validation, you would have to write wrapper documents to cover anything that the vendor documents didn't cover. And in many cases, there's quite a bit around the configuration and the intended use part that needs to be spiked out as part of the wrapper document.
Yeah, to add on to what Jim just said, I think the vendor documentation is very important, but keep in mind that the vendor documentation will typically, they're going to install the system in a manner that's fairly standard and against factory specifications. So their vendor qualification documentation will give you peace of mind as the system owner that the system is working to manufacturer specifications. And then the wrapper documents, or what you might do for the rest of the CSV sort of project and creating other IQ/OQ documents, is really against your intended use. So the vendor specs, the vendor testing is against the vendor manufacturer specifications, and your testing will be against your intended use with your specific configuration in mind.
So here's a related question, and I'm not sure if this really has already been answered by what you just said, but the question is, can a system be valid? Oh, sorry. It is, how do we get the vendor-performed IQ/OQ to cover most of our validation testing?
I don't know if it will cover most. It depends on how you're using the system. If you have a multitude of different methods and applications and different technologies, then I'm not sure it will cover. But what I would typically do first then is take the vendor documentation, create your requirements. So you have your requirements, create your configuration specifications, then do a gap assessment against the vendor qualification documentation in your trace matrix. Whatever requirements of yours in your config spec and your user requirements that you can trace to the vendor testing, great, you've covered that. Anything that is not traced to vendor testing is what's left over, and that's what you need to shore up with your own wrapper documents on the IQ/OQ and PQ testing phases.
Yeah, it'd be very difficult for the OEM to capture, all the different intended uses of the system. So for them to do that, you would have a very large vendor document, in which case some of that may not be critical for you. So, again, like we said, I think most of the vendors do a pretty good job of right-sizing the amount of testing that's done. Obviously, they can't capture everything, so there will always be a need for some type of wrapper qualification as well.
Excellent. Can a system be validated if it does not meet all sections of 21 CFR Part 11?
It can be validated, but you're obviously then taking on some risk, and you'll have to somehow meet other sections of 21 CFR Part 11 through procedural controls, which is a difficult thing to do. It's definitely not the preferred way. I would try to work with the vendor to try and create the technical controls, as that's better than procedural. But if it doesn't meet everything, I would try to utilize procedural controls the best that you can, and document You still need to put those requirements in your requirement spec, and if they're not met in testing, then you need to document that, and they should be part of your deviation reports, and there should be a corrective action. And if you have to, in your validation summary report, simply state the strengths and weaknesses, in this case the weaknesses of your system, so that they're known, and then that becomes part of the training regimen for your users. So you train your users not to do certain things that may create a potentially data integrity infraction.
Should the QA department review your risk assessment before creating the validation plan?
Yeah, I typically include them in the process for doing the risk assessment. What I like to do with a risk assessment is get into a room for an hour or so, whatever it takes, with the members from the system owner group, an IT member and a QA member, and we execute the risk assessment. We ask the questions together. Does the system meet this or that? What's applicable and what's the criticality? So that at the end of that 1 to 2 hour meeting, we have a risk assessment pretty much done, and the members of the meeting are satisfied to sign off and approve the document.
Yeah, so I think the earlier on that you get, everybody on the same page and alignment, probably the better. That way, as you move through the rest of the documentation, there isn't any disconnect between any of the approvers. QA is critical.
Excellent. Should you include requirements in the URS that are not being tested?
If there are requirements that really are genuine requirements that the end users want or need, especially regulatory requirements, I would definitely put them in. Because whether you can meet them or not, they're still applicable to you if that subsection of regulations applies to your environment and the data what you're doing with the data. So yeah, again, I keep them in, and if they can't be met through testing, then again, I want to document it and be transparent that this is the weakness of the system. We know it's a weakness. We will train our user group about that weakness and how to use the system so we don't create any data integrity infractions. You can also kind of create some requirements could be nice to have or wish list requirements versus need to have. So yeah, I don't like to avoid. I like to be transparent and keep them in.
Do HPLC software and controllers in a pharma process also have to conform to Part 11? Who wants to take that one?
Can you read that one more time?
Yes, the wording is, do HPLC software and controllers in a pharma process also have to conform to Part 11?
Yeah, I mean obviously,
if it's electronic, yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say they would be part of, the controller piece, almost would be like a hardware type part of the application. But again, you're validating the system. And again, you have to define in your validation plan what makes up that system and what is in the scope of the validation. But I would think that would be part of the scope of the validation of the project of the system.
Okay. How long does it usually take to validate a basic standalone system?
If it's basically one instrument with one workstation computer connected to it with the application software running the instrument, I think we can typically, depending on the sophistication of the system and the user requirements and how detailed they are, I think we can typically validate that system in 3 to 4 months, give or take. Again, depending on the sophistication of the system and the number of user requirements.
What minimum requirements should be considered during data migration? Are there any guidelines about this?
So probably some minimum requirements I'd look at with data migration is the software the software where the data resides in originally compatible with the data files, the type of files that are created? Are they compatible in the new system? I would be looking at how you're going to do the migration. Is it going to be over the network? Is it going to you're going to move the software into maybe a hard media like a floppy disk? I hope we're not working with that anymore. But if we go to a hard media and then going into the new system, how is it getting there? I would probably, look at, does it have to go through a couple different translations? Does the data need to stay in its original format? Does it go into a PDF file? Does it go into a text file? What are the vulnerabilities when you're transferring it from its original format into some other format? And what are you going to use it for in the end location? So you're migrating it to wherever you're migrating it to. Is it just going to be viewable, or do you still need to be able to analyze the data and process it and report on it? So I kind of look at what you're going to use the data for in the new system and whether those file types are compatible from the old system to the new system.
How should you approach validation of computerized systems for legacy equipment in the manufacturing plant?
Jim, you want to take that? Want to take one?
Sure. So, from a legacy, I take it that these were probably systems that were never validated or had limited validation, or maybe these were systems that were validated a long time ago. I know a lot of companies will do periodic reviews of systems to see if there's any need for revalidation. I would say for legacy systems, depending on how old they are, I would do, again, a risk assessment on it, look at gap analysis to see what was performed previously, if anything, and what gaps are currently, as part of that system that would need to be revalidated to make sure that, again, you're bringing those systems back up into a current compliant state with the current regulations. So that way, if you were audited, you could show that those systems are now back up to where they need to be from a compliance standpoint.
Great. And my apologies. I just realized there was an additional part to that question that I didn't see initially. It had cut off from my screen, and that maybe it just puts a little more information in. And the person said, in my company, we intend to perform a retrospective validation, finding all the historical information of the equipment and completing what is not there with the V methodology of GAMP 5 according to the category of the system. Is this adequate?
Yep, that's pretty much kind of the process I described. Looking at the system, see what was done previously, and looking to see what would need to be done to bring those to a current state. And again, doing validation of the system based on the GAMP 5 that we had talked about today should bring those systems back up into a compliant state.
Yeah, and you may even want to go back and take a look at some of the retrospective, the older data, and if there's anything in that data like a calculation or some processing stuff, make sure that's part of your retrospective validation, just so that you show the FDA that you've not only did a validation that takes into account how the system looks right now today, but 5 years ago, the way you're using it still is kind of fits that validation paradigm right now.
Great. Let's sneak in one more question. How do you handle system administration in systems where the system administrator has delete and modify permission?
Well, first of all, I make sure the system administrator is outside of the system owner group. I like to put them more in IT or some group that's outside, maybe metrology, maybe an engineering group, but certainly not in the lab group that uses it every day, so you remove that conflict of interest. If I can remove the delete, I will do so because there's really no reason to have a delete. But if you can't remove the delete, you certainly have or should have, and you can test the audit trails or activity logs to make sure that any such action is logged by the system. And upon investigation, you could find you could find those activities and when they occurred. You can also proactively, and you should be today, according to the data integrity regulations or guidance, I should say, by the FDA, you should be proactively using those audit trails to look for those types of events, and those activities would be red flags to investigate further. Why was a delete or modification activity taking place? You could even go one step further, and if the administrator needed to utilize a delete or modify activity, you could have them create some sort of a logbook or form that allows or provides for someone else, a peer reviewer or managerial review, to sign off on that activity before it occurs.
Excellent.
If they have access capability, you could proceduralize it in your admin SOP and spell out, when and why they can do certain things.
Fantastic. Well, we're out of time, so we should wrap up. Michael and Jim, thank you so much for your talks today and for answering all those questions.
You're welcome.
I also want to thank everyone in the audience for attending and participating in today's event. And I'd like to thank our sponsor, Agilent Technologies, for making today's webcast possible. Everyone today will receive an email from LCGC alerting you when this webcast is available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who might have missed today's live event. We hope to see you all next time. Goodbye.